like to welcome you to the sixth panel, Diaspora and Today's Ukraine. And just to let you know, or the order of the rest of the proceedings of the conference, of the tail end of the conference, we will hold our panel, and in this panel you will hear a discussion of Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky, among other topics, fascinating topics. And immediately thereafter, we will be doing a book launch of his diary, which I will follow good examples and show you. A priceless source for all we've discussed on this conference and the diaspora. If any of you who are there present at the conference would like a copy of the diary, see Marko Andrejczyk, they are for sale. And so if you have to leave early, definitely take one with you. With that, I return to the normal procedure of our conference. I'm Frank Sisson from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. However, since I reside in Toronto, I was one of the Toronto fog victims of not making it down to this fascinating conference. I still have found listening online extremely informative at how rich the conference has been. And the conference was saved from too many of my comments, at least, by not being there. This totally virtual panel that you will hear today perhaps is very fitting, given that our three speakers are from Ukraine. The first will be Yaroslav Hrycak, professor of the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv and head of the Yatsik program for the study of modern Ukrainian history and society that is affiliated with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. He will speak on Ivan L. Rudnitsky and his Columbia years. We will then have the pleasure of hearing Katarina Kopchenko, research associate at the University of Munster and from the Center of Ukrainian Studies of the Kyiv Taras Shevchenko National University. She will be speaking on the Ukrainian Free University in the intellectual history of the transnational Ukrainian community after World War II. And then our third speaker will be Olha Poluchovich, Associate Professor of the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. She will be speaking and return us to New York for a Ukrainian intellectual in the US, the dilemma of Yuri Kosach's homecoming in the 1960s and 1970s. We will first hear all three speakers, and then we will entertain questions and comments. I remind those of you who are listening online that you should write your questions on the Q&A button, and we will try and fit in as many as we can of them. Now may I ask Yaroslav, please, to speak.
Thank you so much, Frank, for a kind introduction. I'm about to talk about Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky and his years that he spent in the Columbia University. It was rather short period, 4 semesters from fall 1951 till the summer 1953. Even so, this very short period, it was very rich in events that in many ways had a decisive effect on his career. At the very beginning, I have to confess that my presentation is based largely on his diaries that were recently found and published in Ukraine, but also in his correspondence that's preserved at the University of Alberta. So I have to admit that I worked this archive some 30 years ago, a long time ago. So given the time that passed since, some essential moments might be missing. I hope that I will be able to work there again once the war will be finished and to check details. But in the meantime, I have to admit possible factual shortcomings in my presentation. So I say again, I'm not totally confident about some details, which I believe have to be checked. So here is the story. Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky arrived to the United States with his wife on early June of 1951. He left behind his native Lviv, which he fled from the Soviet rule on the Christmas of 1939. Then also left Berlin and Prague, where he made respectively his MA and PhD dissertation, and then post-war Swiss, Germany, and France, where he resided as a refugee. It's exactly in Swiss where he met his future wife, John Benton, American originally from Portland and Oregon, from Quaker's family. So they decided to move together to United States. And his plans were to settle in the United States and to make an academic career there. But he also thought about himself as a public intellectual, if one may use this term anachronistically to the realities of the early 50s. For that sake, he was planning to continue what he was already doing back in Europe. And his plans foremost included a creation of a new center democratic reigning party, free from impacts of both communism and fascism, but also, in a contrast to the old Galician party, the party that would unite West and Eastern Ukrainians of younger generation. And as instrument to form this party, he considered founding a new journal focusing on literary and academic issues, something like Literaturny Naukowy Wysnik, when it was run by Hrushevsky and Franco, not by Donsov. And this was an endeavor that he shared together with friends from Lviv, who also moved to United States, either in his time or later on, namely Vasily Rudko, Yevhen Pizur, and later Man Pritsak, to name a few. In New York, he also met some of his other friends and colleagues, most importantly, Ihor Shevchenko and Ostap Lutsky. He knew Ihor Shevchenko from his PhD studies in Prague, and Ostap Lutsky was his close friend from their school years in Lviv. Lysak Rudnitsky and Lutsky graduated in 1937. Then they parted. Lutsky left for Germany and then for Great Britain. They met briefly after the war in Germany, in the British occupied zone where Lutsky served as a translator in the British Army. Lutsky moved then to Canada, and from Canada to New York. He had a teaching position in the University of Saskatoon, but in New York he enrolled at the PhD program at the Russian Institute at the Columbia University. Like Lysak Rudnitsky, Lutsky was married. In a sense, his North American experience was very helpful for Ivan Lysak Rudnitsky, who was married as well. Lutsky was very helpful in search for an apartment for Lysak Rudnitsky family, and later on he even suggested to live in their old apartment when they moved to another location. But more importantly, Lutsky helped Ivan Lysak Rudnitsky to have a temporary position at the Harvard Refugee Project to conduct interviews with Ukrainian refugees, which allowed Lysak Rudnitsky to survive financially the next 2 months. A part of his friends, Ivan Lysak Rudnitsky was met by his relations, his 3 uncles, Antin the composer, Ivan the journalist, and less known Vladimir the lawyer. They organized for him a welcome party. Lysak Rudnitsky arrived with his mother, Milena. She just passed 60 years and was in very bad psychological shape. She was depressed, therefore it was extremely hard for her to find any position. So she totally depended on his son and his brothers. Relations between Ivan and Milena on one side and Rudnitsky brother on the other were never smooth. There was a lot of tensions, altercations. His current encounters with uncles led him to a conclusion that they were viewed as professionals. Lysak himself, after his arrival, was commissioned to a physical work. He was to pick cherries on a farm, and he was abhorred. And he was abhorred by this perspective. I see there is a question here. Who can see the transcript? Should I react to this comment? Franco, we can only hear you. Could you turn your phone on?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes,
Okay.
everybody can hear you. No, you don't have
Everything is fine. I failed to ask whether my connection is good.
no, you can be heard.
So what I'm saying, Lysak Rudnitsky also was commissioned to physical work. He had to pick cherries on the farm, and he was abhorred by this perspective. Luckily, Lysak Rudnitsky and Nazim, where he could count for help. These were Quaker parents of his wife, Joan. As I said, they met and married in Swiss, where her father had an official position, and then the family returned to the United States before arrival of his daughter and his son-in-law. The Jones family were living in Philadelphia, so the young couple moved there for a while. Lysak Rudnitsky was attending all the public events, including public discussions, and was very positively struck by a difference between Ukrainian and Anglo-Saxon way of discussion. In his mind, to his opinion, Ukrainian discussions were chaotic and long, with a lot of digressions. In contrast, while Anglo-Saxon discussions were extremely well organized and most importantly short. At this time, Lysakronitsky confessed that he was embarrassed by his Ukrainian origin. For him, Ukrainian society is nothing else but gathering of fools and scoundrels, podluki. This is quotation. He was extremely irritated by Ukrainian emigrant nationalists, above all Banderivtsi, who strove to dominate the Ukrainian diaspora institutions. As many other immigrants, it is very essentially important, he didn't believe that Ukrainian army really existed. He thought this was an invention of Banderivtsi propaganda. He also had the problems in the communication with older generation of Central Ukrainian party leaders. He saw them as outmoded and somewhat obscurant. His encounters with Mudry, Fedinsky, and other politicians of the generation went not particularly well, to put it mildly. His attention also covered the Ukrainian academic institutions, above all Naukovo tourist of Shevchenko. After visiting several anti-Shah meetings, he made his verdict. This institution is a corpse, troop. Instead, Lysakronitsky turned his attention toward the Ukrainian Free Academy, UVAN. It made a very positive impression on him. The academy was founded in 1950 and run by Mikhail Vetukhov, who clearly directed the organization toward integration into the United States academic world. And this is what Lysakronitsky liked particularly. Vetukhov was both charismatic and pragmatic and established contacts to the US funds. The other thing that Lysakronitsky liked about UVAN, that unlike anti-Shah, the UVAN united immigrants from both West and Eastern Ukraine, and including also younger Ukrainian intellectuals who came like him from Europe. In short, Ivan Lysakronitsky and his friends were conceiving a kind of the rebellion of youth, Bunt Molodych, against the older Ukrainian establishment, under the slogan of modernization of political and economic life. There was a problem, though, how to combine civic activity, academic career, and whether such a combination would not undermine their chances for success in each of these fields. It was a dilemma that Lysakronitsky discussed among others with Rudko, Vasily Rudko, who at the time was regarded as the leader of their group. That dilemma of combining civic activity, academic career, this dilemma chased the Ukrainian activity since at least the end of 19th century. It was very widely discussed in the case of Ivan Franko, who was an epitome of such a combination, both in positive and negative sense. Franco never managed to write his opus magnus due to his numerous civic responsibilities and distractions. Ernst Gellner, in his comparative biography of Wittgenstein-Malinowski, defined this dilemma as a typically Habsburg dilemma. In a sense, this was choice hunting every intellectual of so-called non-historical nations of the new monarchy. Now this dilemma was transported and transferred alongside with its bearers to the United States. I may be mistaken here. I stand here on very shaky ground, but I had an impression that I both read in the Ivan Lysakronitsky archive collection and then heard it from Yuri Lutsky, that sometimes by early 50s, there has been a public discussion at a small New York cafe in the neighborhood of Columbia University. And this was a public discussion where two mutually exclusive points were presented, respectively by Ivan Lysakronitsky and Shevchenko. The position of Ivan Lysakronitsky may present us as follows. A career, professional success mean a lot, but they do not mean everything. There is a principle noblesse oblige. Who is given a lot has also duties, moral obligations. And moral duties emerge where there is a need. There is no doubt that Ukrainian cause needs young Ukrainian immigrants more than the United States does. Therefore, if they are to choose an academic career, they are supposed to do it with regard to Ukrainian needs. Above all, development of independent Ukrainian academic political thought. Yuri Shevchenko held the opposite view. He said that even though he might be born in the family of elephants, he didn't consider himself obliged to study culture of elephants. Therefore, he and young people are willing to choose anything they want that will bring them to academic success, if needs be, to shy away from Ukrainian issues as far as possible. In any case, regardless if this discussion really happened or not, this was position that both of them pursued later. So following his solution of this dilemma, on September 17, Ivan Lysakronitsky came to New York to enroll at the Columbia University PhD program. Had already PhD program for the German Charles University in Prague. And he also planned to habilitate at the Ukrainian Free University in Munich. Now that he was in the United States, he was persuaded that European PhD would not do in the United States to do a career, so he had to start a PhD program anew. He was very much encouraged in this direction by Yevhen Pezuri Yuri Lutsky. They considered Columbia and Harvard as two alternatives. And finally, they chose Harvard as a cheaper option. Another reason was that a Russian institute at Harvard, as they thought, was dominated by Russian Jews, which were not totally American. And the Russian Institute of Columbia was really American. So Lutsky introduced Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky to Philip Mosley, director of Russian Institute at the Columbia University. Mosley was known for his benevolent position to Ukraine and to Ukrainians. Let me just remind you, in 1934, he visited Soviet Union, and there he sought a meeting with Hrushevsky, but he never did. So Isaac Rudnitsky made a very good impression on Mosley. Mosley advised him to make a PhD at his institute and promised to find funds. And this was very timely because Isaac was in desperate need for money. He and his wife focused on most essential spending. They could not afford even to buy a ticket for cinema. They needed money even more once their first child, Peter, was born in August of 1951, and then Milena, who was left literally with no money, so she had to move in their apartment. So they really need some funding. Mosley was ready to help. He was counting the Ford Foundation that was about to open a new round for fellowships for East European refugees, and his hopes were not in vain. With support of Mosley, Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky got a PhD fellowship, and the remuneration was relatively high. At least it sufficed for Leon Isaac Rudnitsky and his family to move to New York. As I say, they arrived in the summer, September of 1951, and the meeting with Mosley resulted in another project. Vetukhov noticed that there was an interest in the Romano among American academic circles, so there was a chance to get funding for any book about the Romano. Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky wrote his Prague-doctoral thesis on the Romano. Therefore, he came with the idea to publish selected works in English with his introduction and comments. Mosley supported this idea and helped to get funds. That provided Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky with the opportunity to improve his financial situation and also to come up with his first academic publication. With the help of his wife, Joan, and Lutsky, he managed to prepare this collection in a very short time, in half a year. The result that Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky never to manage to repeat in future. He was a rather very slow writer. At that time, his English language was not good enough, so he's writing in German, and John translated it. Even so, Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky was not satisfied with the quality of some Ukrainian contributions to the collections. The book got relatively good academic reviews. So in any case, it was the first academic publication and may serve as a visiting card into the United States academic world. So in September, Isaac Rudnitsky started his PhD studies. Mosley introduced him to Professor Otakal Oldologic, Chair of Central European History. Mosley suggested Oldologic to serve as supervisor, but remained a spiritual Dr. Father of Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky. It was Mosley who suggested to change the topic that Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky suggested. Instead of writing of interwar and war history of Carpathian Ukraine, moved to an early period of 19th century. He also suggested that the final result to be published in the series of the monographs of Russian Institute. The choice was made, and the start was very promising. On the eve of 1952, Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky made his what to do list for the next year, and that 6 points, and number one was PhD studies at Columbia. Another one was improvement of his English. Results of the first year were repressive. He passed his PhD exam with distinction. Mosley wrote that this was the best exam that he ever attended. His evaluation is filled with superlatives, exceptional, excellent style. He also suggested Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky to take a course in West European history. It could be handy once he wants to teach at the American college. Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky enrolled also in the course of Professor Jared Robinson, founder and first director of the Russian Institute at Columbia University. The course focused on problems of Soviet social thought. Robinson had a reputation of the toughest professor and a terror for PhD students. Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky introduced Robinson to Drahomanu, and Robinson was surprised how his view on Russian history and Russia were close to thought of Drahomanu. So when it comes to Ivan Isaac Rudnitsky, Robinson was very positively impressed as well by his presentation at the PhD seminar. In general, it looked like a recurrence of his success at the Berlin University. One of his teachers back then was the no one other but Haushofer. And he also put Ivan Lysakronitsky higher than any other students. Another Columbia professor with whom Ivan Lysakronitsky became close enough was Philip Friedman, a Polish Jew born in Lviv, who survived the Holocaust in Warsaw. Friedman believed that Ukrainians took a particularly active role in extermination of Jews, so they were responsible, partly for Holocaust, but he was ready to work for Ukrainian Jewish reconciliation. And this was also what Lysakronitsky worked since the end of the World War II. Together with Friedman, they started working on a conference on Jewish-Ukrainian relations. And Ivan Lysakronitsky also engaged in Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation. To that effect, when he was still in Europe, he met with Jerzy Gedrich, editor of Paris-based journal Kultura. Kultura played an exceptionally important role in Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation. Ivan Lysakronitsky introduced to Gedrich several Ukrainians. First of all, Bogdan Osachuk, he became a very active contributor of Kultura. To that effect, he also met in New York with Klaudis Hrabek, a Polish journalist and former participant of resistance in the Nazi-occupied Poland. Ivan Lysakronitsky and Hrabek discussed conditions of future Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation with focus on Lviv. And the result of their discussions were conveyed to the Polish immigrant government in London. In short, during the first year of his stay in Columbia, everything went exceptionally well. We don't have a detailed information the second year, 1953. There is a gap on this year in his diary. The diary starts with January 1954, and with information that Ivan Lysakronitsky failed to get a stipend to write his dissertation. Therefore, he had to leave New York and to get back to Philadelphia to find a position. He didn't quit work in dissertation, but he never completed it due to his duties as a teacher at several American colleges. It made a vicious circle. He could not get a proper position in American university without a United States PhD, and he could not defend his PhD dissertation because his teaching duties didn't leave him a space for writing. I could tell the date when he finally quit his plans to finish to work on his dissertation. It must be sometimes by the middle of 1960s, I believe. But finally, he gave up. In contrast with his friends, Umlan Pritsak and Shevchenko, who became Harvard professors, his academic career was a failure. This was what he was constantly reprimanded by his mother and his uncles. They all came from the famous Rudnitsky family, known by their remarkable intellectual achievements. So they put a lot of hope on his proper academic career. And this is exactly what never happened. In a sense, Ivan Lysakronitsky was a big family frustration. In response to reprimands of his mother and his uncles, Lysakronitsky turned their attention to a simple fact. Unlike Yuri Lutsky or John Rashetar, he never got a stipend to write and to finish his dissertation. Later on, when he finally moved to Canada and got a permanent position at the University of Alberta, quite suddenly, Ivan Lysakronitsky discovered the reason of his failure. In the early 70s, at the Congress on the East European history, he met Professor Fisher Galatz, who also was a PhD student at that time at Columbia University. Fisher Galatz approached Rudnitsky and asked him, "Are you this Rudnitsky who was a hero or a cause célèbre?" Rudnitsky thought it was a notorious story with transistor on radio on the bus, with a story which could tell later separately. But it turned to be that Fisher Galatz meant something quite different. It was exactly about the time when the Russian Institute at the Columbia University has been transformed into East European Institute. Ivan Lysakronitsky worked as a young teaching assistant and was about to get a fellowship as a researcher to finish his dissertation. But then he didn't receive a clearance from the CIA. CIA treated him as a person who had some affiliation with the Communist Party in the past. This was a period of McCarthyism, and such allegations were serious enough to finish anyone's career. Mostly at that time stopped supporting Ivan Lysakronitsky and washed his hands. According to Fisher Galatz, this case was widely known among Columbia faculty. Many blamed Master that he failed to defend academic freedom. And Fisher Galatz was surprised that Lysakronitsky didn't know anything about this case. So Ivan Lysakronitsky surmised that he was denounced by Ukrainian nationalists while he was in Austria or Swiss. There has been a long streak of denunciations chased Rudnitsky family from the very beginning of the war. In Krakow, under the Nazi occupation, they were blackmailed by Melnikivci, Ukrainian nationalists, for their Jewish origins. The blackmail stopped once they produced their Aryan documents. His father, who didn't belong to the Rudnitsky family, was also denounced after the war in the British occupied zone for his alleged collaboration with the Nazi. And shortly after arrival to the US, his mother, Milena Rudnitska, was denounced twice on 2 different accounts of collaboration, respectively with Soviet and then with Nazis. In fall of 1952, she had to go through the FBI hearing to exonerate herself from these contortions, and finally she got a clearance. But it exactly this what didn't happen in case of his son. The worst of all, he never knew he was denounced. Otherwise, he had a chance to exonerate himself too. There one way or another, the one thing is for sure. Since these accusations were filled with details of their pre-war and war activities, there was no doubt that it came from a Ukrainian milieu, from someone who knows them very closely and know them very well. In any case, Ivan Rudnitsky regretted that if not this denunciation, his fate would be different. He would be able to finish dissertation and probably then to stay at the Columbia. And a final remark. As I said, Ivan Rudnitsky never made a remarkable career, unlike Omelian Pritsak or Igor Shevchenko. There was a certain degree of personal rivalry between them. At least Omelian Pritsak kept telling behind his back, Rudnitsky back, some nasty things about Ivan Rudnitsky, basically that Rudnitsky was never a historian, but rather a journalist. And is very often transferred to Milena or Ivan Rudnitsky by their mutual friends of Ivan Rudnitsky and Milan Pritsak. Igor Shevchenko also didn't have a high esteem of Ivan Rudnitsky as a historian, but in his memoirs that was recorded by his final years, and I hope that he will publish soon, together with Frank, Igor Shevchenko admitted that he was wrong in underrating Rudnitsky. Rudnitsky was much more important than he really thought. Nowadays, independent Ukraine, Ivan Rudnitsky and his essays are widely known and used, which cannot be said about legacy Ivan Shevchenko and Omelian Pritsak. And here's a deep irony that has to be reflected upon. But I hope this may be a topic for another discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Katerina to move us to the Ukrainian Free University, where Ivan Rudnitsky was going to do a habilitation that he did not do in the end because of his movement to New York. And Katerina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Well, yes.
Yes.
And now I'll try to share my presentation to start. Just a moment. I hope it will function well. So, can you see it?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah. Okay. So on the keynote speech of the Metropolitan Boris Hutsak, the Ukrainian Free University was mentioned several times as a very important institution, also for Ukrainians in America and for the entire Ukrainian diaspora and the Ukrainian communities abroad. So I'll try in my report to develop this statement and to show that it was really so. The Ukrainian Free University, at least as at the post-war period, became really a very important cultural and intellectual center in different meanings, not only in context of the scientific researchers, but also as an institution who played also political and symbolical role for the Ukrainian community. And I want to underline the main principles and the main actors who made this role possible, for that the Ukrainian Free University to the overmentioned role. To my opinion, there are 3 big groups of the actors who investigated, who who made their impact to as the role of Ukrainian Free University as an important center. So one of them is, of course, the Ukrainian diaspora itself, and the Ukrainian communities, and a big role played the American Ukrainians, actually. And the other actor were Germans, the collective actors, because without the German support, the Ukrainian Free University worked on the German territory. Without the support, material, organizational, and also scientific, its existence and development and activity were not possible. And the other important actor was the Ukrainian Church, or generally said churches, but Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church played a very special role also in financial in the development of Ukrainian Free University. So I would like to start a bit retrospective and connect my report with title of our panel. So the influence and the role of the Ukrainian Free University in particular for Ukraine nowadays, for example. So it's about my personal memories. As I finished school, it was the beginning of the independence of Ukraine, early years, 1990s. And there were, of course, lack of the North-Soviet textbooks in Ukrainian history. And as we all know, the first Ukrainian textbooks about from Ukrainian history, there were books from the diaspora, and one of them was of Orest Subtelny, and the second one, it was a work in 2 volumes of Natalia Polonska-Vasylenko, who was a professor of the Ukrainian Free University. So I guess, if I'm not mistaken, sometime the Ukrainian history of Ukraine was the most published Ukrainian textbook at all. It was not translated, it was written in Ukrainian, and actually not only her works and different works, but only her personality is a very important symbol of the transfer of Ukrainian intellectual scientific traditions, of gathering in her personality, her experience of different periods of Ukrainian history and political events during this period. So she gathered also Russian imperial traditions, but as we know, changed her views for Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian state. Then he worked during the first decades of the Soviet power in Ukraine and left Ukraine together with a group of the other scientists before the counter-offensive of the Red Army. So she brought the other Ukrainian new wave of the Ukrainian immigrants. She brought the experience, also experience from the Eastern Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, to the other groups of the professor of the Free Ukrainian University. It is also known fact that the first stop of these immigrants from both Eastern and Western Ukraine, there was a university in Prague. But the new immigrants were very radical and critically orientated against the Soviet power, and the experience and the further events showed us that they were right, that they didn't expect nothing good from the Soviet power, and decided to move further to the Western under the American rules. And so in summer 1949, the most Ukrainian scientists and intellectuals gathered in the capital of Bavaria under the American rules and under their American military administration in Bavaria. Munich became a very important immigration center, not only for Ukrainians, but for them too. But in this life of Ukrainian immigrant community. First, it was so-called TP time of displaced persons, Ukrainians who did not come back to their motherland. Now it was Soviet Ukraine after the Second World War, and who came from it to Western. They made a displaced persons community of Ukrainian. Most of them lived in camps of displaced persons and the intellectual life and intellectual institution, educational and scientific institution like Ukrainian Free University, who was the first one, and among the other such institutions for Ukrainians that played a very important role in gathering of this heterogeneous community into the real transnational Ukrainian diaspora, or as they call themselves in this first stage of the Cold War, Ukrainian immigration, because they underlined their opposition to the Soviet regime and had nothing to do with it, and no direct relations to the Ukrainian state, so they call them immigrants. They were very anti-Soviet orientated, very politically engaged, a big part of these people. And as I already mentioned, the Ukrainian Free University played an important role in the formation of Ukrainian group of Ukrainians who in a few years actually came also overseas to the American continent, in the USA and Canada and other continents, and also European countries, and their common impulses, knowledges, and also this intellectual process taking place during a relatively narrow space and time period during this displacement. They played a very important role for the further activity of the Ukrainian diaspora in all countries and continents. They were also interconnected. And so Ukrainian Free University, as it was refounded in Munich, as I already mentioned, they gathered their scientists from the so-called all immigration of the pre-war period, as well as Ukrainian intellectuals, not only scientists, but also journalists, writers, lecturers, and so on, from Western mostly, and of course a big group of intellectuals from the Eastern Ukraine. So as over-mentioned, Natalia Polonska-Vasilenko described it, at the beginning of the Munich period of the Ukrainian Free University, under the slogan of freedom for science, the representative of science from the Western and Eastern lands of Ukraine, Catholic and Orthodox faiths gathered and created a united Ukraine, Soborna Ukraina, in the name of science. So it was really very important fact and contribution into their creation of this imagined community of the big groups of Ukrainians who never lived in the common state and who had to communicate and to consolidate into their big group of transnational community. This first period during the time of displaced persons, first period of activity of the Ukrainian Free University was, or seems to be first, very successful. For example, in 1948, on the peak of its activity, the Ukrainian Free University had 27 ordinary, 20 extraordinary, 2 guest professor, 16 associated professor, 17 contract lecturer, and 11 assistants. So it's a rather big part, we can say, but it's no wonder if you take into consideration that Lubomir Wiener, for example, said that there were collected that there were about 200 Ukrainian scientists among the displaced persons. And there are also a group of old immigrants who also lived in Germany, for example, in the interwar period, who didn't belong to the displaced persons community, but also were Ukrainians, for example, old generation like Dmytro Doroshenko or Ivan Merchuk and some others, who also brought together their previous Ukrainian scientific traditions and the tradition of Ukrainian institutions abroad. Not only the Ukrainian Free University itself, who were renewed on the old Prague principles, but also, for example, the traditions of the Ukrainian Scientific Institute, which existed in the 20 or 30 years to the end of the Second World War in Berlin. Its task of scientific and educational activity. So the professor of Ukrainian Free University, of course, took it very seriously, but it was not only aim and not only task of them. Another important aim of the university was its role of a mediator between Ukraine and even broadly Eastern Europe and the West. And the idea was to bring scientific knowledge about Eastern Europe and especially Ukraine to the audience of the Western world. It was, of course, very important aim, and they tried to realize it already during the first period of activity. And the big contribution to the realization of this idea were made by one of the first rectors of the Ukrainian Free University, Ivan Merchuk. He was a figure who, as I already said, lived in Germany for a long time. He had mixed German-Ukrainian origin, so was very good integrated also in German intellectual circles. So he always tried to make connections with universities in Germany. First of all, of course, with Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, with Bavarian authorities, and so he was also recognized from the German side and was that he became a correspondent member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, 1954. It was, of course, also important for Ukrainian scientists abroad and for Ukrainian Free University. So it was a very successful but rather short period of the history of the Ukrainian Free University. As I already mentioned, it was important not only for the university but also for the whole Ukrainian community. But the further period brought challenges which were very big of material origin and also of organizational, because most part of the students of Ukrainian Free University and a big part of their professors and lecturers lived to the other countries, mostly overseas, of course. Later it played an important role for the renewal of or establishment of its lecture activity. But at that time, it was a very difficult situation, also combined with the money reform in the re-established Western German state, or founded, it's correct to say, German state, brought to the problems in the activity of the Ukrainian Free University. But they never stopped their activity, and the professor searched for the possibilities to work on the new conditions. And very important was a decision to stay in Germany, because there were ideas also to leave, to replace the university in the other countries. But the decisive argument was that in Germany, the Ukrainian Free University could stay, or could be actually the private, little, but separate university, it could be autonomous and independent from the big German scientific or educational institution. It was extremely important for the professors of the Ukrainian Free University because they wanted not only to develop and to provide Ukrainian science, but also institutional independence and presence of Ukrainian university as a separate institution was very important in the case to show that Ukrainian science actually exists. And that was the argument in spite of all difficulties to stay in Germany and not to move to the countries where the most part of the potential students lived. It was also not only a decision from the Ukrainian Free University, but later I'll tell about the other Ukrainian scientific institution who cooperated with them, but what was a very important argument. So I would say that the other actors that I announced, the German side actually, played a very important role in the activity of Ukrainian Free University. And it was represented mostly from one side by the professors of Slavic studies, Eastern European studies, of course, who were really engaged and were well informed in the problems of the Ukrainian science and Ukrainian Free University. And yes, from the other side, there were German authorities for, first of all, of course, in the Bavaria itself, because in German, the federal state, the main educational questions are actually belong to the spheres of the federal states, actually. So Bavaria and the city of Munich were the first contact persons, so to say, contact organization for the Ukrainian Free University. So it was very important to receive their support from the German side. Without it, the university could not exist. So, and such support the university received very early. Already in 1940s, in this early stage of displacement, as American military administration, where until the establishment of the German state was main administration in the region, they asked about the Ukrainian Free University. Actually, their local German authorities, and this request in May 1947 was sent to the Bavarian government about information of a so-called Ukrainian university attended by persons of Russian origin, as it was formulated in the American request. And on behalf of the Bavarian government, this report entitled "The Ukrainian Free University and Us" was prepared by the German professor Erwin Kashmira. And he started his overview with actual difference between Ukrainians and Russians, with a separate and independent role of the Ukrainian language. And so to describe actually the historical introduction, it was very important to explain the Americans, and not only, probably to German authorities too, these big differences and the right of Ukrainians to have their own educational institutions. So he also underlined that it was not possible to compare a Ukrainian Free University, this little institution with two faculties, with the German state universities. It was not the case. But it's a very special institution. He meant that it was important for the whole 40 millions of Ukrainians, not only immigrants, but the whole Ukrainian communities, who has the only this possibility to have their voice in the free world, free from the control of Moscow regime. So the other arguments formulated by Professor Kashmira were very interesting, very important, and It was about the necessity to support Ukrainian science and Ukrainian Free University as natural allies of Germany, because it keep immigrants from the contemplation of communist propaganda, for example. But it was not the only argument, of course. The others were that Germans should support the intellectuals from Eastern Europe, because it was a kind of compensation for the crimes of the National Socialists from one side, and from the other side, it also was a contribution to this competition with Russia and Soviet Union in the Cold War. So both arguments were very important for the further support, and where they were actually repeated by the other German authorities and professors, and among them there as Professor Stadtmüller, as you have seen before, he also was also of the idea to gather all the Ukrainian scientific and educational institutions under the roof of one institution. It was at the beginning of the 1960s. The Ukrainian Free University exists mostly as a scientific institution, so they have their representatives in France, USA, and Canada, but they could not provide lectures, and their professors worked as a scientist, so it was some kind of research institution for that time. So the other argument, Ukrainian Free University had to leave for a school rooms who were given to them in their first building in Munich. The school needed it for its own purpose. So the other institution, like Ukrainian Technical and Economic Institute, replaced from Podebrady first, and worked in Regensburg. It also came, at least at the end of the DP period, also came to Munich. And some other Ukrainian scientific institutions were little. Partly they were in similar situation. They had to find some other way and other forms of their further existence. So it was an idea proposed by the German professor Kashmira to create a house of Ukrainian sciences. So together under one roof of 3 Ukrainian organizations. And it was actually done on the beginning of 60. And 3 institutions, as you can see, Ukrainian Free University, Ukrainian Technical Economic Institute, and the European Department of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, they decided to join it. And there was also founded a special foundation for working community of support of Ukrainian science. They consisted of Ukrainian and German scientists and authorities, and the all mentioned professors, German professors, they became members of its scientific advisory board. So they met regularly and discussed the directions of the scientific work of the Ukrainian Free University, of the Technical and Economic Institute. And for example, we should say that due to German financial support, who also was foreseen by the creation of this House of Ukrainian Sciences, the Shevchenko Scientific Society could prepare the further volumes of the Lexicon of Ukrainian Studies, Encyclopedia Ukrainoznavstva, for example. And the Ukrainian Free University, the other institutions, they became the new rooms, the new building, rented specially for this purpose for the House of Ukrainian Scientists, and paid from German federal and Bavaria state government, the city of Munich. And So it gave the possibility to the Ukrainian free universities to think about the renewal of their lecturers and their work as a real university, not only as a research institution. So it was a very important step, and if in this stage the creating of the House of Ukrainian Sciences, due to contribution of the German side, of course, it was possible to provide and to organize the further existence of the Ukrainian university. So there are further steps like renewing of the lecturers' activity. It was possible also due to support of the Ukrainian community abroad, and first of all of the big Ukrainian community. This side of the activity of Ukrainian Free University is also known. There is a book published about this Ukrainian Free University Foundation in the USA. I wouldn't speak probably a lot about it. It's this history is known in the USA, first of all, but from the perspective of the Ukrainian Free University, we should say that it became some kind of obligation or activity of the rector, Professor Yaniv, and he played a very important role in the bringing the information of activization of the support of the Ukrainian Free University by the Ukrainian communities on the American continent, where the diaspora was mostly strong. A very important argument was that the alumni, the graduates from the Ukrainian Free University, also lived to the USA and Canada, and these organizations, clubs, and the other organization of the former students, and not only, they could be turned at least to the foundation with possibilities to support Ukrainian Free University financially. So the trips of Professor Yaniv in the 1970s to the USA, they became regularly, two times normally a year. He met Ukrainian press and youth organization and this alumni organization and so on. So in a few years, his activity led to a big support and to some good, in a good sense of the word, propaganda of the necessary to support Ukrainian Free University from abroad. So the other actor of the development of further development of support of the Ukrainian Free University was a church who also supported their Ukrainian Free University as a congregation of the Oriental churches in Rome, and concretely the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Cardinal and Metropolitan Joseph Slepy. As a former Soviet political prisoners, he supported the Ukrainian Free University personally and interested, of course, in the further development of Ukrainian science in the free world. So the money for the separate and own building of the Ukrainian Free University actually was given mostly from the sides of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which played a very important role in the activity and life of Ukrainian diaspora community, also in Germany, as you can see. But this building of the Ukrainian University, why it was necessary to buy it? Actually, because a new German educational law, not German, but Bavarian educational law, requested for universities, also private, to have their own building, not rent one, to be recognized as a higher school, as a university. So the House of Ukrainian Sciences still existed, and the other organization kept together with the Ukrainian Free University, but The house was bought especially for the university to give them this right to proceed the activity and to be recognized officially by the German authorities. It was very important at that time. So the university moved to his own building, which also proceeded the tradition of the House of Ukrainian Sciences and became an important center for not only for education, but also for as a cultural center for the entire Ukrainian community in Munich. The re-establishment of their lecturers and of the pedagogical activity of the Ukrainian Free University also was some kind of challenge, and so it provoked professors to search for the new forms of activity, because the university could not exist as the regularly high school, and they just had not enough Ukrainian students in European countries. Yeah, the community in Germany, French, Great Britain, Belgium were not very small, but it was, of course, not enough when compared to American diaspora. And here they also showed their creative attitude and their possibilities to find a new form of existence after a few years of search of a form of its existence. It was chosen their intensive summer semester on July and August, when the normal universities, big state universities, had their vacations. So the professors and Ukrainian students could come and to receive an additional educational Ukrainian studies. Of course, it was seen as a proceeding of their normal education in different countries by Ukrainians. And also the other regular form of lectures, it was our summer School of Ukrainian Studies. If the regular lectures, it was orientated on the master studies and for doctorates. The courses of Ukrainian studies, it was orientated of all people who just wanted to hear them, and who, for Ukrainians living in different countries, who wanted to just knew more about Ukrainian cultural language and so on, and just to understand the Ukrainian identity. And the number of students was, of course, not too big, but it depends. And almost every year, 20 to 40 and 50 students took part on such lectures. And the part of the professors also increased quickly. So, for example, at the end of 1973, the teaching staff on both faculties, philosophical and law, or faculty of law and economy, it consists of 73 teachers. Of course, a big part, almost half of them, there were guest professors from the USA, as well as the students too. During 8 years, 1971-78, different courses organized by Ukrainian Free University, attended by a total of 878 people. Biggest part of them, 588, represented 10 European countries, but the other part, for example, 182 came from the USA, 91 from Canada, 12 from Australia, and so on, also in South America. So we can say it was also, it was really a center where the Ukrainians from different countries came to meet and to hear courses in Ukrainian studies. And also their professors and teachers from the USA were very deeply involved in this teachers process. So the role of the Ukrainian community from the other countries was also big, not only in studying process, but also in financial support of the Ukrainian Free University. So I'll come slowly to conclusion, and so want to underline, of course, it's such a big subject that I cannot pretend to show the full picture of its activity, but I want to underline this again, this important actors and factors of the activity of the Ukrainian Free University and of the success in its activity in the after-war time. This creative attitude to an organizing of a studying process. Besides of the mentioned lectures and summer courses, there were the role of little courses with special purpose, for example, for the priests of the Orthodox Church, for the Ukrainian teachers from the Sundays or Saturday schools, for example, and so on, and the special courses for Ukrainians in different countries. So it was very flexibly, and the professors found different ways to work as a research university. They described the Ukrainian Free University. It became also actually the intellectual center of the entire Ukrainian community. It was also an important intermediate between their Ukrainian and German scientists. I just shown a few parts of the contacts between the Ukrainian scientists and the Germans. As Ukrainian students came to Germany, Ukrainian Free University also tried to show them European culture, German culture, and so on, being also a contact persons in this case. As they worked in Germany, as Professor Yanev described it, that as the role of the Ukrainian Free University as a cultural intermediate, it's also based on this own history that the university found in Vienna, then moved to Prague, then to Munich. It was like an interconnection between the different, not only of Ukrainian immigrants and its periods on, but also like an intermediate between different European places, gathering this experience and trying to bring it to a Ukrainian auditory. And the other very important role of the university, it was seen of its professors, lecturers. It was also this work for the Ukrainian community, popularization of Ukrainian studies. They also connected it with a movement of the 70 years of university extension. To bring knowledge about Ukraine to the most widest circles of the Ukrainian community, organizers of public lectures almost every week. Ukrainian Free University became really a cultural center and such a point for different events, exhibitions, and so on of the Ukrainian community in Munich, in Germany, and not only, as I already described. And of course, a very important part was publishing activity in foreign languages. First of all, of course, Germany. Here left on the picture, you can see the periodicals of the Ukrainian Free University after the establishment of the House of Ukrainian Sciences, Haus der Ukrainischen Wissenschaften in German. These Mitteilungen, so reports of this House of Ukrainian Sciences, were published until early 1980s, and then it was renamed in the yearbook of the Ukrainian Studies. It was published in German. Also included scientific publications of Ukrainians, and not only. It has a character of some kind of report for the Germans who gave financial support to the activity of the university to show that they had a result, of course. But from the other side, it was, of course, a method to bring Ukrainian sciences in German language to the further, at least scientific or intellectual resources in circles in Germany too. So I'll try to conclude this my observation. So this phenomenon of the Ukrainian Free University during the long post-war period was that the later went beyond the framework of the educational and scientific institution, performing at the same time the role of the intellectual center and intellectual mediator, a career of intellectual tradition of its representative, both institutionally and substantively. And the difficult condition in which the university worked prompted teachers and the students to search for a new flexible form of interaction with various participants and partners. And significant achievement of the university was its transformation in such an intellectual institution for and some kind of cultural center of the entire Ukrainian diaspora, thanks to the extensive system of horizontal ties through, for example, teachers and alumni, Ukrainian and Germans, Ukrainian communities in different countries. And actually, this interconnection with German environment was also very important. So thank you for your attention, and yes, yeah, I'll be ready to discuss it.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Professor Pulukovich to give her talk on Yuri Kosach, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Sisson. I'm happy to present my research today in such professional and esteemed community. So the title of my presentation is A Ukrainian Intellectual in the US, The Dilemmas of Yuri Kosach's Homecoming in the 1960s, 1970s. And I know that this topic is very broad, and homecoming is here conditional term. Because I'm going to tell you which challenges, problems, and new perspectives revealed Yuri Kosach's visits to the Soviet Ukraine. And in my presentation, I would also reflect on the role of the diasporic archives on the life and works of Yuri Kosach. Originated from the aristocratic Kosach-Dragomanov family and being a grandson of Olena Pchilka, or Olga Dragomanova-Kosach, and the nephew of Lesya Ukrainka, he gained a reputation as a talented writer, though a controversial figure in Ukrainian literature and intellectual history. Though Kosach's books of fiction are widely published in contemporary Ukraine, they gained little readership attention and are hardly discussed today. So my presentation derives from my work on a book of Yuri Kosach's intellectual biography, in which I touch on different periods of his life, a life that witnessed almost all the turbulences of the 20th century, both in Ukraine and abroad. Writer, editor, journalist, and translator, Yuri Kosach studied at the Lviv Gymnasium and graduated from Warsaw University. In his student years, he tested nationalist ideology, which in Western Ukraine was aimed at its liberation from the Polish domination. Shortly afterwards, he became close with Western Ukrainian communist cycles, who knew little about life in Soviet Ukraine before early 1930s. Subsequently, the Polish authorities accused Kosach of both nationalism and communism. He was imprisoned in Warsaw in 1931 and in Lutsk in 1932. Avoiding a third arrest, he fled to Czechoslovakia in 1933. Later on, Kosach would live in Prague, Paris, Berlin, and Lviv before surfacing in the post-war DP camps. He arrived in New York in September 1949 and primarily lived in the city until the end of his life. The life of Yuri Kosach is more or less explored until 1949, so when he comes to the US. Due to the works of Sergei Romanov, Marko Robertstach, Rostislav Radishevsky, Vera Ageyeva, among others, as well as the memoirs of Kosach's contemporaries, Yuri Sharek-Shevelyov, Ostap Tarnavsky, and Grigory Kostyuk. All three memoirists depict Kosach in the 1940s as an extravagant, colorful, and contradictory, though a very talented writer. Living in New York, Kosach dreamt of homecoming. In 1953, he wrote in desperation, I quote, "A return to the native land, or death," end quote. In 1959, he sent an open letter to the National Writers' Union of Ukraine, in which he greeted a meeting of Soviet Ukrainian writers on behalf of Ukrainian emigration in the US. His letter was published in the state newspaper Literaturna Ukraina, Literary Ukraine. In September of the same year, he began to edit so-called Soviet-oriented journal За синім океаном, Behind the Blue Ocean, 1959-1963, in an attempt to establish a connection to his homeland. After the publication of his journal, he ultimately gained the fame of the betrayer, Zradnik, among the Ukrainian American community, and consequently was ostracized by it. Kosach became the center of attention of the Ukrainian community overseas, and his name appeared regularly in Ukrainian American publications. For example, the oldest Ukrainian American newspaper, Svoboda, published critical essay on Kosach and За синім океаном journal. The Philadelphia journal Kyiv, where Kosach had published his literary works in 1950s, printed an article Dійство Юрія Хамелеона, a story of the wanderings of Yuri the Chameleon. Without indication of its authorship and in very sharp terms, the piece criticized Kosach's political activities, but mainly Kosach himself, stating, I quote, "Kosach is a mentally ill person," end quote. In due course, Kosach used the Senym Okeanom journal to strike back at the Ukrainian emigre community. He emotionally criticized his country fellows and mainly nationalist-oriented part of it by authoring pamphlets against it. Here, the Ukrainian community is depicted as something that has nothing in common with Ukraine and its people. In Kosach's opinion, the main flaw of the Ukrainian emigres is their alienation from the real life of Ukraine. They recreate the country as an imaginary place which they perceive as real. He points to, I quote, "the fading of his country fellows between the reality of the foreign country and the imaginary reality of their illusory homeland," end quote. Besides these invectives and pathetic articles, the voice of Kosach was rarely heard. But such self-testimony can be found in the archives. And that was the first time when I saw such evidence. So doing my research in the US in 2018, I found Kosach's letter to Yuri Shevelyov, another Ukrainian intellectual in the US, at the Bakhmetiev archive at Columbia University. In this letter, Kosach tries to explain his situation in more or less rational manner. And this ego document, his self-testimony, retells the entire situation from his own perspective, providing the readers with an understanding of his life and his historical sense of self. Kosach's letter to Shevelyov was written in 1978. Before I will tell more about this letter, I would like to go into the history of the friendship between Yuri Sharek-Shevelov and Yuri Kosach, which ended in the US. Yuri Sharek-Shevelov, then Kharkiv-based linguist and intellectual, first met Kosach in Lviv in 1933. Shevelov was amazed by Ukrainian spirit of Lviv of those times, and he wrote memoirs about his impressions, where he calls Lviv the capital of Ukrainian Piedmont. He was pleased to see the rich intellectual life in which Kosach and his work Obloga, the siege, was in the center. It was staged more than 30 times, if I'm not mistaken, at the Lviv Opera House, and was extremely popular among Ukrainians. According to Shevelov, Літературно-мистецький клуб, Literary Artistic Club, was the intellectual center of Lviv and Galician, Galicia, attracting writers, scholars, and artists from the Soviet Ukraine. For him, apart from private meetings and conversations, the evenings in the club created the impression of Lviv as, I quote, intellectual center of an independent Ukraine. Shevelov, as well as the memoirist, literary scholar Grigory Kostyuk, were two visitors to Lviv from eastern Ukraine. Their visits to Lviv, for both of them it was the first time during World War II, became a significant part of their intellectual biographies, as they could observe an alternative to how to build Ukrainian culture in the circumstances of occupation. Shevelov and Kosach met again in the post-war DP camps on the territory of Western Germany in 1945. Shevelov was among the most active initiators of the organization of Ukrainian writers in exile called Мистецький Український Рух, Artistic Ukrainian Movement. This organization was launched in 1945 and united writers both from the eastern and western parts of Ukraine. Presumably, the Lviv experience was crucial for Sharek-Shevelov, who immediately, right after war, organized Ukrainian artists, many of whom he met in Lviv, around the group. Yuri Kosach was also among the creators of the group, and he was also the member of the board. During the DP period, Kosach was an extravagant artist who painfully accepted any critical remarks to his persona. This was the reason why he often left the group without any explanation. But then he turned back after being coaxed by Shevelov, Kostetsky, and Ulas Samchuk, the head of the group. This group wanted to have Kosach as talented, intellectual, and gifted dramaturg and novelist. His plays were staged in the DP camps, and his prose gained a positive reception from Shevelov and Domontovich. After the DP camps, both Kosach and so shortly after Shevelov migrated to the US, but they did not contact each other there. I saw the memoir, it was presumably Kosach who wrote this, that they were at the Metropolitan Opera, sitting nearby, but they pretended as if they did not see each other, and of course they did not talk to each other. So, coming back to Kosach's letter to Shevelov of 1978. This letter was written to Shevelyov after the publication of Shevelyov's book «Друга черга. Література, театр, ідеології» The Second Round, Literature, Theater, Ideology, published in New York by Suchasnist in 1978. This is a collection of articles of literary criticism written mainly during the post-war period. In his book, Shevelyov states that his literary career was finished, career as a literary critic, was finished in 1956 because of the lack of high-quality writings from Ukrainian artists both in Soviet Ukraine and North America. In his preface, Shevelyov mentions Kosach, implying he is not creatively alive, but dead. I quote, Sherek applies to Osmachka and Kovalenko as if they were alive. They do not live. Yuri Kosach abandoned literature and chose the Kiev Union of Writers. But the laws do not have retroaction, and the literary works of the dead live after the pen fell out from his numb or deadened hands. Having found his name in Shevelyov's preface, Kosach writes a letter to him, though being skeptical about Shevelyov's reaction and potential response. However, Kosach is aware of the historical value and significance of his letter, which he writes more, I quote, to interested and non-interested descendants. In this letter, Kosach sums up his condition as being Ukrainian artist abroad. And some of his idea I found in earlier publications in the 1960s, particularly in the Toronto newspaper, Вільне слово, free speech. But let's come back to this letter. I will quote several sentences from this letter. I remain the person whom I always was, anti-Visnikivets, anti-nationalist, anti-servilist, and realist. The second, I belong nowhere, I was obliged to no one for nothing, I did not swear loyalty to no one, and thus I could betray no one. For more than 30 years, I was not only part of the emigre community, but even among the Ukrainian diaspora, I have only a few true friends. And he ends his letter to Shevelyov, no, ladies and gentlemen, there will be no rehabilitation as there will be no repentance. Ukraine has given me the moral strength that allows me the possibility to overcome this period of neglect. So, thus, in this letter, I would like to comment several points. Kosach explains his situation. And taking account his biography, we have a ground to trust him overall. So anti-Visnikivets here relates to the newspaper edited by Dmytro Dontsov when Kosach was active writer of it. Літературно-науковий вісник, Literary Scientific Herald, and it's why he is saying that he's anti-Visnikivets relates to his conflict with the ideologue of Ukrainian nationalism Dmytro Dontsov, whose conception was extremely influential during the interwar period and really influenced on the whole generation of Ukrainian writers, both in Western Ukraine and Eastern as well. Being at odds with the Ukrainians in the US, Kosach also did not fit into any literary group. When he arrived to the US, new literary organizations and groups appeared, most notably the Slovo, the Word organization headed by Grigory Kostyuk. Grigory Kostyuk invited Kosach to join the Slovo group in 1950s, but Kosach refused. By that time, he was a guard at the Princeton University. He was a storage. And at the same time, a new group appeared, I mean the New York group of poets. And to this group he could not belong because of generational and aesthetic constraints. The members of the New York group and Yuri Kosach evaluated highly the works of each other, but their personal communication did not occur. Bogdan Boychuk recalls that Kosach hardly appeared at our literary evenings. He never was in our company, nor did he visit our private parties. In effect, he belonged nowhere. And this feeling of non-belonging was prominent during Kosach's life in the US. The reason he established connections and visited Soviet Ukraine was his desire to publish his works and to see his readership there. However, the Soviet authorities did not trust him, and this is yet another story. They restricted his trips to Ukraine. His books were printed in a small amount of copies. He was not introduced as a nephew of Lesia Ukrainka or grandson of Olena Pchilka in the Soviet publications and during the meetings. And mostly important, that Soviets did not support his journal, I mean the Sinim Okeanom, which he saw as a bridge between the Ukrainians in Ukraine and Ukrainians in North America. And of course, Kosach did not get any state awards. In his letter to Shevelov, Kosach also forms his attitude to Ukraine. One of this sentence in a letter to Shevelov reads, "My sights, as always, were directed at Ukraine only, although maybe not to the enchanted, but the real one." Here, Kosach appeals to his collection of short stories, Enchanted Ukraine, Чарівна Україна, written in 1937, when he lived in Paris. And in this collection, we can trace the psychological inconveniences and living abroad, being alienated from his homeland. Also, what Enchanted Ukraine, we can interpret this quote further, and in context of the appearance of realitate, so-called realitate, in the North America, and their attitude to the existence of the Ukraine under the Soviet Ukraine. Of course, often traveling to Ukraine, Kosach knew about persecution of dissidents, Russification, total state control, the policy of disprivileging Ukrainian culture and censorship. When in 1971, grand galas commemorating Lesia Ukrainka 100th anniversary took place all over the Soviet Union, her youngest sister, who lived in the US, Isidora Kosach-Borisova, was targeted by the Soviet authorities. After forced labor in Stalin's camps for 2 years for anti-Soviet activities in 1930s, Kosach-Borisova refused to visit Soviet Ukraine when, I quote, "captivity reigns and innocent people are arrested." Yuri Kosach, on the contrary, accepted the invitation and visited the Soviet Union. Unlike his aunt, Kosach Borisova, he never lived in Soviet Ukraine, though knew, of course, about the communist crimes and genocidal politics against Ukrainian intellectuals and writers. And he, of course, realized that the empire was occupying his country. But on the other hand, he had his own strategies of resistance, though not evident ones. For example, in his historical novel of the late 1980s, Regina Pontica, Volodarka Pontide, he wrote, "You can't break through the wall with your head. Головою муру не проб'єш." Thus, he was thinking about useful strategies of anti-imperial resistance in terms of long-lasting colonial status of the Soviet Ukraine. I have to finish. I see I have to wrap up. So this is the only part of the story, and the documents which I found in North America at the archives and speaking to people who knew Kosach himself, I understood how complex is his story and how often we can underestimate the role of ego documents of Ukrainian writers. And subsequent research led me to Ukrainian archives, in which I was surprised to learn that Kosach very often did 2 copies of his letter. One was sent to his address and another was preserved for his own archives, thus for the future readers. Living alone in New York, Kosach felt the necessity to speak for himself, and witnessing through the archival documents was a means. And of course, in some these documents, as the evidences of his country fellows, undermine myths about him as a controversial writer. And of course, these documents should be taken into consideration. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, we thank you so much. We're going to have a general call for questions, but first, if I can just maybe pose just comments, and you can either wait till afterwards to answer. The first is to Yaroslav, and that is the degree, has anyone looked through Mosley's material at Columbia? If indeed professors were aghast at what had happened to Leszek Rudnitsky, is it not possible that we would have some documentary evidence? There may be none because of the nature of what their contexts were, and has anyone done that? Then to Katerina, just a general comment. It strikes me that one important aspect that perhaps should have been paid attention to, particularly when we talk about the North American diaspora, was the significance of the degrees being recognized by the Ukrainian Free University, and the role that played with a number of people who taught in North America and had to have doctoral degrees. And indeed, as we know in the case of Ivan Leszek Rudnitsky, he was about to do his habilitation at UVU as he was leaving for New York. And I've always wondered, but of course the thesis was not said, but of course in many cases, I think that was an essential role in promoting people to academic positions in North America, was that recognition. And then just a stray comment to Olha's talk. At least I had heard rumors, and rumors are often not true. We met Kosach, did come to Harvard, but I had heard that he also was allied with the Russian communist organizations at that time, Arrow Farm and Monroe, where there were a number of contacts with the Soviets. But as on a broader point, have you been able to look at a broader portrayal of Kosach from the point of view of the KGB, and now that the SBU archives are open, and has that provided any broader context in his development? And then I assume that Marko Andrejczyk will be taking care of questions from the floor. So perhaps if you would answer those 3, and we'll wait for Marko to go up and to take questions. So yeah.
So what is the order? Should we respond in the order?
In the order that I posed them, I think the order that you spoke.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's the order. Yes.
I haven't had chance to go through the mostly files. I believe they're not in Columbia. They probably in Penn State University, but I'm not sure. I have it somehow back my memory. But this fragment that I quoted, I discovered during my last visit to Alberta Archive. It was right before the COVID. It was accidentally, so it was kind of discovery. So he didn't have chance to say to develop this issue, to elaborate this issue so far. But I hope that they will do it in future. But definitely, I believe that it makes sense to look through most of the archive and everything that is related to the story.
And then Katarina.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments. Yes, of course, the question of the proportion and scientific degrees was very important, and the actual doctorate students were one of the main groups of the activity of Ukrainian Free University. And the recognition of this scientific degrees, it was also a long process, also from the German side. And contrary to the USA, I guess in Germany it was not so easy because the doctors of the Ukrainian Free University, they were always, they were not simply their philosophy doctors like German university, but also they had also said that they are doctors of Ukrainian Free University, so the special additional explanation showed that it was kind of a separate private university, and it did not so such equal as a German universities, for example. By all support from the German side, it was like some difference, but you have totally right. It was a big, really. Plays an important, significant role for the promotions by role of Ukrainian scientists, also from the United States of America, who later also came to teach at the Ukrainian Free University too, for example. Yes, I'm not ready to list all the people who promoted. I wrote it in a big article, for example, mention them, but yes, big works of people who promoted Ukrainian Free Universities, they were published often and the public series, for example, Varia as a separate printed. So it was actually a big contribution to scientific activity of the Ukrainian Free University. And yes,
Well, and I think our crossover is, and Professor Shevelyov being one of the people with a degree as well, I would take it, yeah, of significance for our other top. And then Professor Polukovich, I don't know if there's anything, would you like to comment on that? Yeah.
Yes, regarding the KGB archives and Kosach, yes, there was a short plot when Kosach became close with so-called Russian Federalists who published the newspaper Новое русское слово, if I'm not mistaken. It looks like that, yeah. New Russian word back in 1950s, but it was a very short plot, which was not perceived seriously by the Ukrainian emigre community. And as for the KGB archives, there was one document that described Kosach's activity in North America. Right after he came back to the US from his first trip to Ukraine. in 1964. He came there for the celebration of the Shevchenko's 150th anniversary, and at the time there were also Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir at this same time as Kosach was. They were late for the celebrations because the celebration took part in March, but they arrived in summer, in June. And two events occurred when there was a fire at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, which was done on purpose, in which many documents and archival sources were burned, and also the painting by Alla Horska at the Taras Shevchenko University was broken and was not repaired. And it was like Kosach wanted to go to the Soviet Ukraine earlier, but he was restricted from his trip. But coming back, the Soviets reported that after when he came back to New York, he became more aggressively attack Ukrainian community in North America, and by the Ukrainian diaspora, it was immediately recognized as new Sovietophilicism, новое радянофильство. It was a tactic of Moscow to discredit the positive role of Ukrainian immigration, of Ukrainian intellectuals. And Kosach, as a nephew of Lesya Ukrainka, the grandson of Olena Pchilka, was a perfect figure for this. But as I mentioned, when he came to Ukraine, and even if you look at the books which were published in Kiev, he was never introduced as a nephew of Lesya Ukrainka. It was, but it was later. So at least in 1960s, he was not introduced as such. And that's the Soviets, they did not trust him because they did not support his journal, the Sinim Okean, which was closed, and they did nothing to rescue this journal also.
Thank you.
Do we have
Are
any
there any-
questions on the floor here?
Yeah.
No questions here? No.
No questions on floor, then I will go to our questions. So we have some general questions from Mr. Tsiligakis. I'll just give the one of them and see if you'd like to answer this. General question to all the panelists. Can you comment on the comparative success of each of the diaspora communities to preserve and transmit the Ukrainian language to younger generations? Did the diaspora communities assimilate linguistically with their host societies? If anyone would like to comment on that or else answer that on our answer piece.
I could comment briefly. As for Yuri Kosach, he never switched to English language. He wrote all his novels until 1980s in Ukrainian only. And his visits to his homeland and correspondence with Ukrainian writers and editors, it was means for him to preserve his Ukrainian language, because if you read, for example, Volodar Pontidi, Regina Pontica, it is what amazes me personally as a literary scholar, as a philologist, that he did not lose Ukrainian language, and probably these visits to his homeland also influenced this.
But did he know English enough to write in English language? He was the first generation. This was the common problem for the oldest immigrant who came after the war. He didn't manage to comment English language. So that's probably the answer.
Yes, but he also knew many other European languages, as German, Spanish, and he translated from these languages in 1930s. Yes, probably. Yeah, he was working on physical works. Probably, yeah, and probably it was not his aim to learn English. I don't know, because he regarded himself as a Ukrainian writer.
Okay, and if other and
We do have a question here from the
Yeah.
floor. Natalia Kanenko-Friesen, you probably don't see us. I'd like to thank all the panelists for very interesting presentations that to me, they all spoke to each other. And I'd like to focus on memoir writing or diary keeping. I missed to hear, maybe I just simply zoned out, but did Kosich keep diaries or did he leave a memoir behind? And the question to Katerina, out of all that great faculty which has served the university in Munich, if we look at, again, memoirs and that sort of personal ego documentation, which ones you'd point out to go and enjoy reading when it comes to memoirs and diaries from the faculty which has taught there?
yes, please.
Did you hear me?
Yes, Katerina, probably you're the first.
Maybe Oля or Katerina, doesn't matter.
Olga, why don't you go first? And you
Ola, you
ask,
were
and then Katarina, okay?
Yes, okay, yeah, thank you for this question. There are some of his notes. It's not diary, in fact, it's very fragment. When he lived in Paris in 1930s and during the DP camps period, I mean, post-World War II. But in the US, not all of his letters even were preserved, as he had very chaotic life and changed apartments very frequently. So not all of his correspondence was preserved.
Thank you, Katerina.
It's if it's about memories concerning activity or founding of the Ukrainian Free University, for example, we have different variants of memories of Natalia Polonska-Vasilenko. They all are published, I guess, in Ukrainsky Historic and also in a big volume published in Kiev, her general memories. I guess she writes about different events and different stage of activity of the Ukrainian Free University. The other documents, me personally didn't find very big memoirs, probably in such kind of different, not memoirs, but just a little explanation or a bit remarks about Ukrainian Free University, if we speak concretely about this institution. The problem is this archive of the university itself is did not really very well organized and reviewed, and probably some personal funds of some personals includes a document which still be evaluate or probably even found, because it's in some chaotic stage, I guess, if we speak about probably founding of a new materials. Until now, I didn't found the memoirs especially about Ukrainian Free University. There is a big corpus of memoirs about DP time of the Ukrainians from that time, and some mentions about Ukrainian universities were in memories of different people who were in the DP camps, for example. There are big volumes about Ukrainian DP camps, and some mentions we can met there. So a lot of memoirs are already published. Also in the USA, it's about Mittenwald, Regensburg, Schaffenburg, and so on, so Ukrainian DP camps. And that period of the war is mentioned there, but except of Natalia Polonska-Vasylenko, I cannot find in the moment some big corpus of memories about the university.
Frank, we have two more questions on the floor, which will take us probably to 5 o'clock. So we'll, Malia Andreevska.
Thank you very much for your presentations. This is a question to all of you. I mean, you've kind of dropped hints about this. Slavko has talked openly about sort of discovering Ivan Lysiak-Rudnitsky. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences discovering the diaspora?
I find hard to answer this question because the experience is so huge and so immense that I could not say somehow to articulate it. Basically, this is what I say. What I would have a question to Katerina as well. I know a lot of stories. And basically, the stories, how say, they're much more colorful, rich in details, and they are rarely confirmed by diaries and by correspondence. And this is something which I believe struck me sometimes. And when I'm talking about Uvu, I remember visiting in the 1990. I was probably one of the first from Ukraine who visited Uvu at that time. And what struck me was the average age of the professor. They were in their late 70s. And this was really kind of the domination of all the generation. And I believe, I know for sure that Bavarian ministry was requiring to do something about that, to accept a new faculty, which is kind of embarrassing for them because they keep saying that we start to rejuvenate all the kind of things. So basically what I'm saying, there are some, I would say, some very problematic stories about Uvu, also including the story that by that time Uvu was probably dominated by the Banderivtsi. Yanni was a rector of the Uvu, but he was definitely Banderivets, and I don't know actually when it happened, but this impression was that all the university was dominated by Banderivts and their supporters or sympathizers. And also not the committee you referred to, the United American Committee, which made fundraising, also was very much Banderivts. I know these people, so to say. And this is something which I believe is very important because basically we're talking about the stories. But I believe I have to go more personally in this sense. So to have details to this which are very, very important about orientation, political orientation, about their, say, tensions, all the kind of things. Because otherwise we become, say, to some extent, how should I say, stories which are very much official.
Should I reply or?
Yes, quickly, please, because we have one more question.
Yes, but to my opinion, the policy from German side, for example, was not to support political activity. So in the EU, they try to distance from political questions, really. One of the reasons they have the possibility to make policies somewhere else. For example, not only Yanni belongs to Banderist circles, but also, for example, Grigory Vaskovich, who played an important role in Bandera, exactly. And he habilitated in EU and had upper position like a vice-rector, I guess. But they distanced very special, very conscious from all political questions. And their teaching body of the WU consisted of different people. So as a guest teachers, the other people came there. So officially in the documents, they never protected or supported some political positions or questions. They tried to stay into intellectual or scholar questions. I would say so. It does not accept their political activity in other organizations. They tried to protect the image of Ukrainian Free University as non-political but intellectual institution.
Okay, thank you for your answers. We are basically out of time because our next panel
Okay.
starts without a break. So Frank, I'll leave it to you. to
Okay,
close.
so that what I would say, we have one more question. Katerina, would you answer for Professor Per Rudling? Did you get it in your quick Q&A site? Yeah, so if you would just answer to him, and otherwise I would like to thank you for participation in this session. We immediately go into a session on the memoirs of Professor Ivan Leshak-Rudnitsky. So I would ask you now, to those of you who are online, to join that session. I would say to the people who are online that you can purchase the memoirs from CIUS Press, since you are not present in the hall at the moment. And with that, I'd like to thank our presenters and thank those who gave questions. And please invite you all to join us to hear about, I think, a quite extraordinary, I'm sorry, I said memoirs, I should have said diaries, and that's the important issue, to see the diary, to discuss the diaries of Professor Ivan Leshak-Rudnitsky. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and I assume we cut now. Yeah, leave. All right, and Slavko, you have to go to another.
Okay.
In.
Okay. I'll do it.